For our midweek reflection, we turn to Judges chapter 20, beginning with verse 1. Please hear the word of the Lord. Then all the Israelites came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. And the congregation assembled in one body before Yahweh at Mizpah. The chiefs of all the people of all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers bearing arms. Now the Benjaminites heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the Israelites said, "Tell us, how did this criminal act come about?" The Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered, "I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, and I and my concubine to spend the night. The lords of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house at night. They intended to kill me, and they raped my concubine until she died. Then I took my concubine and cut her into pieces and sent her throughout the whole extent of Israel's territory, for they have committed a vile outrage in Israel. So now you Israelites, all of you, give your advice and counsel here." All the people got up as one, saying, "We will not any of us go to our tents, nor will any of us return to our houses. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The narratives in the Hebrew Scriptures don't always present us directly much more than a mixed bag of stories and texts from which we need to do a lot of work to understand God's guidance and direction. This text, like so many others, calls us to reflect not simply from the perspective of this exact narrative, but looking at the larger stream of revelation and thought presented in the entire scope of the book of Judges. If we look throughout the text of Judges, we'll find plenty of other examples of failed leadership, of times when the people should have risen up to answer the challenge of enacting God's justice and to follow God's leadership. But we see instead event after event of failed leadership, of people not standing up to protect the interests of God and protect the needs of the people around them, but rather protecting some other interests. How is it that we can go about life and hear calls and summons for justice and get very easily riled up and still miss the whole point of justice? How is it that we can become very emotionally charged with events and descriptions and depictions of events? And we want to respond to an immediate issue, an immediate circumstance with vigor and vim and seeking revenge and violence against individuals who have done harm, and yet we so often fail to look at the underlying issues. We fail to address systems. We fail to respond to what builds a context for those individual actions, those individual events where people go beyond the established norms. How can we follow God's leadership when we are so often torn, seeking to build up our own selves, our own sense of well-being, rather than truly seeking to elevate justice where it needs to be? This text here in Judges chapter 20 is dependent upon the scenes depicted in the chapter before. We find a Levite and his concubine, and she has run away from home. She has gone back to her father's home, and it has taken likely a journey of 2 days for her to get back to her father's house. Apparently, this concubine is probably a teenager, a young girl who has fled abuses that she has suffered and considered that it was worth a flight of 2 days to get back to her father's house, hoping to escape some kind of abuse that this Levite had heaped upon her. And when she arrives at home, her father takes her in and offers her a modicum of comfort. And then the Levite arrives to reclaim her as his property, his possession. The father is constrained by social norms of the day. He seems to be aware that she had not been treated well by the Levite, and yet the social norms indicate that she is property and belongs to the Levite and not to himself. So the father follows the norms of the day, follows the social constructs, and he insists that the Levite simply hang around for a time and enjoy his hospitality. And he wines and dines him, and then he sends him to refresh himself, to enjoy the comforts and use the daughter for his personal pleasure, hoping that by remaining present in the home where the Levite and his daughter both are reunited, that this will offer her some level of protection from worse abuse. The scene extends for several days as the father continues to press the Levite to stay one more day, one more night, one more day, one more meal. Let me extend my hospitality and feed you yet one more time. Until finally the Levite has had enough, and as the day is closing, he stands and gathers his things. He calls his servant and he calls the concubine, and they set out on the journey to return to their home. They make a bad choice on the way in terms of which city they might stay in, and they land in Gibeah after night has fallen. And they find themselves in the city square, and an old man comes and he finds the strangers there in the market, and he invites them into his home to offer the shelter and protection of his hospitality. We find a theme that takes us back to Genesis chapters 17 and 18 as we look upon Abraham's hospitality offered to strangers that have come near his tent. And the man carries the Levite and his servant and his concubine into his household and provides for them, offers them care until the lords of the town, as we see in chapter 20, the men, the rabble, the mob come and demand that this stranger be handed over to them. The scene repeating what we find of Abraham's nephew Lot arriving in Sodom. The outsider. And the people of the town seeking to wreak havoc and to take the strangers to have come into town and abuse them that they might feel themselves of higher standing, importance, character, power. This desire to abuse here comes as a threat to the Levite. The man of the house who is offered his protection and hospitality says, "No, citizens, please do not do this evil thing. The man has a concubine. I have a virgin daughter here. Take them and use them for your satisfaction, but leave this man alone." There's arguing. There's complaint. The mob continues to seek to enact their displeasure upon this stranger who has come into their midst until the Levite takes his own concubine and throws her out to them and shuts the door behind. All through the night, the mob takes out their anger and frustration upon her. And she somehow manages to return to the doorstep of the house and lay her hand upon it, but has not the strength to enter in. The Levite finds her in the morning and tells her to get up, take her place upon the animals so that they might return, and she is unable to move. So he takes her unceremoniously and straps her to the animals, and he and his servant depart for home. Arriving, he is distraught at the insult inflicted upon him. And he takes her body, cuts it in pieces, and sends it out among the tribes of Israel as a summons, a call for seeking justice against the townspeople of Gibeah. The plight of the concubine is hardly considered. She was chattel. She was property. She was simply there to be present at his beck and call, the beck and call of this Levite. She was abused partly at his instigation because he throws her out into the night knowing what would happen to her. And he is upset at the injustice leveled against himself. Blind, oblivious to the injustice that he has heaped upon this girl, that he calls his concubine, that he takes as his property. This girl he is supposed to love and cherish and care for. To him, she was property. She was there for his pleasure. A slave recognized as mistress in the eyes of all, but less than him. And so she becomes a symbol. She becomes a rallying cry as he issues a call to justice, a call for revenge, a call for reckoning among the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, she was not the important one in this story. She was not the center, the focus of the attention of this Levite. She was rather the one to bear the brunt of the affront laid against him. The summons, the call to justice was not a call or rallying cry to vindicate her and her death and her injury and her pain, her suffering. No. It was about the injury enacted upon him. A man, a Levite, a member of the household of Israel, who had been offered protection of the hospitality of a man in Gibeah, and yet the townspeople did not honor that covenant contract of hospitality toward strangers. He was furious because his life had been devalued. He had been dehumanized. He had been called upon to service the townspeople of Gibeah the way he used the concubine to service his own whim and pleasure. Israel heard his cry for justice, and the tribes turned out armed to the teeth, ready to go and wreak vengeance upon this town. Not because this woman had been violated. Not because her life was forfeit. Not because she had been abused, but because the structure of society was under attack. If these townspeople could dehumanize, devalue this male member of their society. Was this a call for justice? Was this a call to care for the least and the vulnerable around us? No. It was a call, it was a cry to support the structures of an unjust society. To hold the men of the society up as more powerful, more worthy, so that they might continue to devalue others, to dehumanize others, and feel vindicated in doing so. The scriptures tell us that life is to be deemed as sacred. That the life of all of creation depends upon God, upon Yahweh, who gives life, whose breath moves in and out of our nostrils, this woman included. And yet the society was willing to readily dehumanize her, as long as they could uphold the structure of the larger society, while they dehumanized others. It's difficult to look at justice from a systemic standpoint. It's a whole lot easier to look at individual moments, individual actions, and seek out bad actors who are doing things that are for us beyond the pale. The problem is when the injustice that we see enacted by those individuals we want to blame and punish and chide are really the same attitudes that we harbor toward others. It's only when the tables turn and we find ourselves confronted with injustice that we tend to be willing to take a stand, to raise our voices and cry out, not for justice, but for revenge. A summons to justice would look very different from what we find in this text. It would look like creating equality for all. It would look like valuing all human life, not male over female, not wealthy over poor, not Israelite over non-Israelite, not known over unknown, friend over stranger, but valuing all life as given by the same God who gives us our breath. The cry for justice requires that we look at those structures around us to see how injustice has crept into the ways that we have standardized the living of life. We are not called to superiority over others. We're called to recognize our equality of dependence upon one another and upon God. And that equality calls us to understand what justice really means. It means caring for all those around me. By responding to the abuse I see in others, by looking also at my own actions and my own attitudes, that I might be cleansed of the same crimes I more readily decry in the lives of others. There is no justice until the systems that we uphold treat us all, one another, as brothers and sisters, creatures of God Most High, in whom God's very Spirit resides. Until we can honor God's life in the life of all those around us, our cries for justice will simply never measure up. Until then, we must continue to take a long, hard look, not at the injustice of those people somewhere out there, but take a hard look at how injustice might have creeped into our own lives, our own thoughts, our own actions and attitudes. Until we elevate all around us as creatures beloved by the Creator, children of the Heavenly Father, equals in the eyes of God.